Welcome to Men of the West, where we delve into the lives of those who shaped our world through courage, conquest, and sometimes catastrophe. Here, we explore not just the battles and empires, but the minds and hearts of the men behind them. Let's journey into the past, where every step echoes with the weight of history. I'm Shawn Michaels, and this is Men of the West. Welcome to a supplemental episode of Men of the West. I'm Shawn Michaels, and today we're diving into a timeless telling of a timeless man, Belisarius, the last Roman general, as captured in Famous Men of Ancient Times by S.G. Goodrich. If you caught our full episode on his life, you've walked with us through the battles and betrayals that defined him, a saga of conquest and collapse. But don't worry, if you haven't, this reading stands alone, a window into his legend straight from the pages of a 19th century classic. Picture it, a story stripped to its essence, crafted for a world eager to remember its heroes. No analysis, no embellishment, just the words as Goodrich wrote them, bringing Belisarius back to life. So settle in, let the centuries peel away, and hear the echo of a man who shaped the West. Belisarius. This celebrated general, to whom the Emperor Justinian is chiefly indebted for the glory of his reign, was a native of Germania, on the confines of Thrace, and was born about the year 505. It is probable that he was of noble descent, liberally educated, and a professor of the Christian faith. The first step in his military career was an appointment in the personal guard of Justinian, while that prince was yet heir apparent to the throne. The Roman or Byzantine Empire at this period embraced almost exactly the present territory of the Turkish dominions in Europe and Asia Minor, with the addition of Greece, Constantinople being its capital. Italy was held by the Goths, Corsica, Sardinia, and Barbary in Africa by the Vandals. Justin I, an Illyrian peasant, having distinguished himself as a soldier, had become emperor. His education was of course neglected, and such was his ignorance that his signature could only be obtained by means of a wooden case, which directed his pen through the first four letters of his name. From his ascension, the chief administration of affairs devolved to Justinian, his nephew and intended heir, whom he was reluctantly compelled to raise from office to office, and at length to acknowledge as his partner on the throne. His death, after a languid reign of 9 years and a life of nearly 80, left Justinian sole sovereign in name as well as in fact. In order to appreciate the life and actions of Belisarius, it is necessary to understand the character of the new emperor, during whose long reign his great exploits were performed. The first act of Justinian on ascending the throne was to marry a dissolute actress named Theodora, who, though licentious, avaricious, cruel, and vindictive, soon acquired an almost complete control over him. His mind was essentially feeble and inconstant, and though his Christian faith was doubtless sincere, it was less fruitful of virtues than of rites and forms. At his accession, his treasury was full, but it was soon exhausted by his profuseness, and heavy taxes were imposed, offices put to sale, charities suppressed, private fortunes seized, and in short, every act of opacity, injustice, and oppression practiced by his ministers to support the wasteful magnificence of the court. The troops of the empire at this period were by no means what they had been in the time of Scipio or Caesar. They consisted to a great extent of foreign mercenaries, and were divided into squadrons according to their country, thus destroying all unity of feeling and annihilating that national spirit which once made the Roman arms the terror of the world. These hired troops, which greatly outnumbered the native soldiers, marched under their own national banner, were commanded by their own officers, and usually followed their own military regulations. The inefficiency of such mingled and discordant forces is obvious. Yet it was under such a system that Belisarius entered upon his military career. With a feeble and corrupt government, an ill-appointed and trustless army, the Roman Empire was still surrounded with powerful enemies. It is scarcely possible to conceive of a great nation in a condition of more complete debility and helplessness than was the kingdom of the Caesars at the period in which Belisarius appears on the active stage of life. Kobad, king of Persia, after a long cessation of hostilities, renewed the war toward the close of Justin's reign by the invasion of Iberia, which claimed the protection of the emperor. At this period, Belisarius, being about 20 years of age, had the command of a squadron of horse, and was engaged in some of the conflicts with the Persian forces on the borders of Armenia. In conjunction with an officer named Sidus, he ravaged a large extent of territory and brought back a considerable number of prisoners. On a second incursion, however, they were less fortunate, for being suddenly attacked by the Persian forces, they were entirely defeated. It appears that Belisarius incurred no blame, for he was soon after promoted to the post of governor of Dara and the command of the forces stationed there. It was at this place that he chose Procopius, the historian, as his secretary, and who afterwards repaid his kindness by a vain attempt to brand his name with enduring infamy. Soon after Belisarius obtained the command of Dara, Justinian came to the throne, and enjoined it upon his generals to strengthen the defenses of the empire in that quarter. This was attempted, but the Persians baffled the effort. Belisarius was now appointed general of the East, being commander-in-chief of the whole line of the Asiatic frontier. Foreseeing that a formidable struggle was soon to ensue, he applied himself to the raising and disciplining an army. He traversed the neighboring provinces in person, and at last succeeded in mustering 25,000 men. These, however, were without discipline, and their spirit was depressed by the ill success that had long attended the Roman arms. In this state of things, the news suddenly came that 40,000 men, the flower of the Persian army, commanded by Firuz, was marching upon Dara. Confident of victory, the Persian general announced his approach by the haughty message that a bath should be ready for him at Dara the next evening. Belisarius made no other reply than preparations for battle. Fortifying himself in the best manner he was able, he awaited the onset, exhorting his men, however, by every stimulating motive he could suggest, to do honor to the name and fame of Rome. The battle began by a mutual discharge of arrows, so numerous as to darken the air. When the quivers were exhausted, they came to closer combat. The struggle was obstinate and bloody, and the Persians were already about to win the victory when a body of horse, judiciously stationed behind a hill by Belisarius, rushed forward and turned the tide of success. The Persians fled, and the triumph of Belisarius was complete. They left their royal standard upon the field of battle with 8,000 slain. This victory had a powerful effect, and decided the fate of the campaign. The aged Kobad, who had conceived a profound contempt for the Romans, was greatly irritated by the defeat of his troops. He determined upon a still more powerful effort, and the next season sent a formidable army to invade Syria. Belisarius, with a promptitude that astounded the enemy, proceeded to the defense of this province, and with an inferior force, compelled the Persian army to retreat. Obliged at length by his soldiers against his own judgment to give battle to the enemy, he suffered severely, and only avoided total defeat by the greatest coolness and address. Even the partial victory of the enemy was without advantage to them, for they were obliged to retreat and abandon their enterprise. Soon after this event, Kobad died in his 83rd year, and his successor, Nushirvan, concluded a treaty of peace with Justinian. The war being thus terminated, Belisarius took up his residence at Constantinople, and here became the second husband of Antonia, who, though the child of an actress, had contracted an exalted marriage on account of her beauty, and having filled a high office, enjoyed the rank and honors of a patrician. While thus raised above the dangerous profession of her mother, she still adhered to the morals of the stage. Though openly licentious, she obtained through her bold, decided, and intriguing character, aided by remarkable powers of fascination, a complete ascendancy over Belisarius. It is seldom that a man is great in all respects, and the weakness of the general whose history we are delineating was exhibited in a blind and submissive attachment to this profligate woman. A singular outbreak of popular violence occurred around this period, which stained the streets of Constantinople with blood and threatened for a time to hurl Justinian from his throne. The fondness of the Romans for the amusements of the circus had in no degree abated. Indeed, as the gladiatorial combats had been suppressed, these games were frequented with redoubled ardor. The charioteers were distinguished by the various colors of red, white, blue, and green, intending to represent the 4 seasons. Those of each color, especially the blue and green, possessed numerous and devoted partisans, which became at last connected with civil and religious prejudices. Justinian favored the blues, who became for that reason the emblem of royalty. On the other hand, the greens became the type of disaffection. Though these dangerous factions were denounced by the statutes, still, at the period of which we speak, each party were ready to lavish their fortunes, risk their lives, and brave the severest sentence of the laws in support of their darling color. At the commencement of the year 532, by one of those sudden caprices which are often displayed by the populace, the 2 factions united and turned their vengeance against Justinian. The prisons were forced, and the guards massacred. The city was then fired in various parts. The Cathedral of St. Sophia, a part of the imperial palace, and a great number of public and private buildings were wrapped in conflagration. The cry of "Nika! Nika! Vanquish! Vanquish!" ran through every part of the capital. The principal citizens hurried to the opposite shore of the Bosphorus, and the emperor entrenched himself within his palace. In the meantime, Hypatius, nephew of the Emperor Anastasius, was declared emperor by the rioters, and so formidable had the insurrection now become that Justinian was ready to abdicate his crown. For the first and last time, Theodora seemed worthy of the throne, for she withstood the pusillanimity of her husband, and through her animated exhortations it was determined to take the chance of victory or death. Justinian's chief hope now rested on Belisarius. Assisted by Mundus, the governor of Illyria, who chanced to be in the capital, he now called upon the guards to rally in defense of the emperor. But these refused to obey him. Meanwhile, by another caprice, the party of the blues, becoming ashamed of their conduct, shrunk one by one away, and left Hypatius to be sustained by the greens alone. These were dismayed at seeing Belisarius issuing with the few troops which he had collected from the smoking ruins of the palace. Drawing his sword and commanding his veterans to follow, he fell upon them like a thunderbolt. Mundus, with another division of soldiers, rushed upon them from the opposite direction. The insurgents were panic-struck and dispersed in every quarter. Hypatius was dragged from the throne which he had ascended a few hours before, and was soon after executed in prison. The blues now emerged from their concealment, and falling upon their antagonists, glutted their merciless and ungovernable vengeance. No less than 30,000 persons were slain in this fearful convulsion. We must now turn our attention to Africa, in which the next exploits of Belisarius were performed. The northern portion of this part of the world, known to us by the merited byword of Barbary, hardly retains a trace of the most formidable rival and opulent province of Rome. After the fall of Jugurtha, at the commencement of the 2nd century, it had enjoyed a long period of prosperity and peace, having escaped the sufferings which had fallen upon every other portion of the empire. The Africans in the 5th century were abounding in wealth, population, and resources. During the minority of Valentinian, Boniface was appointed governor of Africa. Deceived by Aetius into a belief of ingratitude on the part of the government at home, He determined upon resistance, and with this view concluded a treaty with the Vandals in the southern portion of Spain. These, embarking from Andalusia, whose name still denotes their former residence, landed at the opposite cape of Ceuta, A.D. 429. Their leader was the far-famed Genseric, one of the most able but most lawless and bloody monarchs recorded in history. Of a middle stature and lamed by a fall from his horse, his demeanor was thoughtful and silent. He was contemptuous of luxury, sudden in anger, and boundless in ambition. Yet his impetuosity was always guided and restrained by cunning. He well knew how to tempt the allegiance of a foreign nation, to cast the seeds of future discord, or to rear them to maturity. The barbarians on their passage to Africa consisted of 50,000 fighting men, with a great crowd of women and children. Their progress through the African province was rapid and unopposed, till Boniface, discovering the artifices of Aetius and the favorable disposition of the government of Rome, bitterly repented the effects of his hasty resentment. He now endeavored to withdraw his Vandal allies, but he found it less easy to allay than it had been to raise the storm. His proposals were haughtily rejected, and both parties had recourse to arms. Boniface was defeated, and in the event, Genseric obtained entire possession of the Roman provinces in Africa. Carthage, which had risen from its ruins at the command of Julius Caesar and been embellished by Diocletian, had regained a large share of its former opulence and pride, and might be considered, at the time of which we speak, the second city in the Western Empire. Making this his capital, Genseric proceeded to adopt various measures to increase his power, and among others, determined upon the creation of a naval force. With him, project and performance were never far asunder. His ships soon rode the Mediterranean and carried terror and destruction in their train. He annexed to his kingdom the Balearic Islands, Corsica, and Sardinia, the last of which was afterwards allotted by the Vandals as a place of exile or imprisonment for captive Moors. And during many years the ports of Africa were what they became in more recent days, the abode of fierce and unpunished pirates. With every returning spring, the fleet of Genseric ravaged the coasts of Italy and Sicily, and even of Greece and Illyria, sometimes bearing off the inhabitants to slavery, and sometimes leveling their cities to the ground. Emboldened by long impunity, he attacked every government alike. On one occasion, when sailing from Carthage, he was asked by the pilot of his vessel to what coast he desired to steer. "Leave the guidance to God," exclaimed the stern barbarian. "God will doubtless lead us against the guilty objects of his anger." The most memorable achievement of Genseric, the sack of Rome in 455, is an event too much out of the track of our narrative to be detailed here. We can only pause to state that after spending a fortnight in that great metropolis and loading his fleets with its spoils, he returned to Africa, bearing the Empress Eudocia thither as his captive. She was at length released, but one of her daughters was compelled by Genseric to accept his son in marriage. The repeated outrages of the Vandal king at length aroused the tardy resentment of the court of Constantinople, and Leo I, then emperor, dispatched an army against him, consisting of nearly 100,000 men, attended by the most formidable fleet that had ever been launched by the Romans. The commander was a weak man, and being cheated into a truce of 5 days by Genseric, the latter took advantage of a moment of security, and in the middle of the night caused a number of small vessels filled with combustibles to be introduced among the Roman ships. A conflagration speedily ensued, and the Romans, starting from their slumbers, found themselves encompassed by fire and the Vandals. The wild shrieks of the perishing multitude mingled with the crackling of the flames and the roaring of the winds, and the enemy proved as unrelenting as the elements. The greater part of the fleet was destroyed, and only a few scattered ships and a small number of survivors found their way back to Constantinople. A peace soon followed this event, which continued uninterrupted till the time of Justinian. Genseric died in 477, leaving his kingdom to his son Hunrek. About the year 530, Gelimer being upon the Vandal throne, Justinian began to meditate an expedition against him. His generals, with the exception of Belisarius, were averse to the undertaking. The same feeling was shared by many of the leading men about the court, and in an assembly which the subject was under discussion, Justinian was about to yield to the opposition when a bishop from the east earnestly begged admission to his presence. On entering the council chamber, he exhorted the emperor to stand forth as the champion of the church, and in order to confirm him in the enterprise, he declared that the Lord had appeared to him in a vision, saying, "I will march before him in battles and make him sovereign of Africa." Men seldom reject a tale, however fantastic, which coincides with their wishes or their prepossessions. All the doubts of Justinian were at once removed. He commanded a fleet and army to be forthwith equipped for this sacred enterprise, and endeavored still further to ensure its success by his austerity in fasts and vigils. Belisarius was named supreme commander, still retaining his title as general of the East. In the month of June, AD 533, the Roman armament, consisting of 500 transports with 20,000 sailors and nearly the same number of soldiers, became ready for departure. The general embarked, attended on this occasion by Antonia and his secretary, the historian Procopius, who, at first, had shared in the popular fear and distaste of the enterprise, but had afterwards been induced to join it by a hopeful dream. The galley of Belisarius was moored near the shore, in front of the imperial palace, where it received a last visit from Justinian and a solemn blessing from the patriarch of the city. A soldier recently baptized was placed on board to secure its prosperous voyage. Its sails were then unfurled, and, with the other ships in its train, it glided down the straits of the Bosphorus and gradually disappeared from the lingering gaze of the assembled multitude. With a force scarcely 1/4 as strong as that which was annihilated by Genseric about 70 years before, Belisarius proceeded upon his expedition. Having touched at Sicily and Malta, he proceeded to the coast of Africa, where he landed in September about 150 miles from Carthage, and began his march upon that city. He took several towns, but enforcing the most rigid discipline upon his troops and treating the inhabitants with moderation and courtesy, he entirely gained their confidence and goodwill, and gave him such a reception as might be expected rather by a native than a hostile army. When the intelligence of the landing and progress of the Romans reached Gelimer, who was then at Hermione, he was roused to revenge and took his measures with promptitude and skill. He had an army of 80,000 men, the greater part of whom were soon assembled, and posted in a defile about 10 miles from Carthage, directly in the route by which Belisarius was approaching. Several severe skirmishes soon followed, in which the Vandals were defeated. The main army now advanced, and a general engagement immediately ensued. In the outset, the Vandals prevailed, and the Romans were on the eve of flying, defeated from the field. A pause on the part of Gelimer was, however, seized upon by Belisarius to collect and rally his forces, and with a united effort he now charged the Vandal army. The conflict was fierce, but brief. Gelimer was totally defeated, and with a few faithful adherents he sought safety in flight. Knowing that the ruinous walls of Carthage could not sustain a siege, he took his way to the deserts of Numidia. All idea of resistance was abandoned. The gates of Carthage were thrown open, and the chains across the entrance of the port were removed. The Roman fleet soon after arrived, and was safely anchored in the harbor. On the 16th of September, Belisarius made a solemn entry into the capital. Having taken every precaution against violence and rapacity, not a single instance of tumult or outrage occurred, save that a captain of one of the vessels plundered some of the inhabitants, but was obliged to restore the spoil he had taken. The soldiers marched peaceably to their quarters, the inhabitants continued to pursue their avocations, the shops remained open, and, in spite of the change of sovereigns, public business was not for a moment interrupted. Belisarius took up his quarters in the palace of Gelimer, and in the evening held a sumptuous banquet there, being attended by the same servants who had so lately been employed by the Vandal king. With his usual activity, Belisarius immediately applied himself to the restoration of the ruinous ramparts of the city. The ditch was deepened, the breaches filled, the walls strengthened, and the whole was completed in so short a space as to strike the Vandals with amazement. Meanwhile, Gelimer was collecting a powerful army at Bola, on the borders of Numidia at the distance of 4 days' journey from Carthage. Having placed the capital in a proper state for defense, at the end of 3 months from its capture, Belisarius led forth his army, leaving only 500 troops to guard the city. Gelimer was now within 20 miles of the capital, having raised an army of 100,000 men. No sooner had the Romans taken up their march toward his camp than they prepared for battle. The armies soon met, and Belisarius, having determined to direct all his endeavors against the center of the Vandal force, caused a charge to be made by some squadrons of the horse guards. These were repulsed, and a second onset also proved unsuccessful. But a third prevailed after an obstinate resistance. The ranks of the enemy were broken. Zazo, the king's brother, was slain, and consternation now completed the rout of the Vandals. Gelimer, under the influence of panic, betook himself to flight. His absence was perceived, and his conduct imitated. The soldiers dispersed in all directions, leaving their camp, their goods, their families, all in the hands of the Romans. Belisarius seized upon the royal treasure in behalf of his sovereign, and, in spite of his commands, the licentious soldiers spent the night in debauchery, violence, and plunder. Gelimer fled to the mountains of Papua, inhabited by a savage but friendly tribe of Moors. He sought refuge in the small town of Medinas, which presented a craggy precipice on all sides. Belisarius returned to Carthage and sent out various detachments which rapidly subdued the most remote portions of the Vandal kingdom. Immediately after the capture of Carthage, he had dispatched one of his principal officers to Justinian, announcing these prosperous events. The intelligence arrived about the time that the emperor had completed his Pandects. The footnote reads, "These were a digest of the civil law of Rome, made by the order of Justinian, and have been preserved to our time. They contained 534 decisions or judgments of lawyers, to which the emperor gave the force of law. The compilation consists of 50 books, and has contributed to save Justinian's name from the contempt and reproach which had otherwise been heaped upon it." End of footnote. The exaltation of the monarch is evinced by the swelling titles he assumes in the preamble of these laws. All mention of the general by whom his conquest had been achieved is carefully avoided, while the emperor is spoken of as the pious, happy, victorious, and triumphant. He even boasts, in his institutes, of the warlike fatigues he had borne, though he had never quitted the luxurious palace of Constantinople except for recreation in some of his neighboring villas. While the Roman general was actively employed at Carthage, Pharis was proceeding in the siege of Medinas, which had begun immediately after the flight of Gelimer. Pent up in this narrow retreat, the sufferings of the Vandal monarch were great, from the want of supplies and the savage habits of the Moors. His lot was likewise embittered by the recollection of the soft and luxurious life to which he had lately been accustomed. During their dominion in Africa, the Vandals had declined from their former hardihood and yielded to the enervating influence of climate, security, and success. Their arms were laid aside, gold embroidery shone upon their silken robes, and every dainty from the sea and land were combined in their rich repasts. Reclining in the shade of delicious gardens, their careless hours were amused by dancers and musicians, and no exertion beyond the chase interrupted their voluptuous repose. The Moors of Papua, on the contrary, dwelt in narrow huts, sultry in summer, and pervious to the snows of winter. They most frequently slept upon the bare ground, and a sheepskin for a couch was a rare refinement. The same dress, a cloak and a tunic, clothed them at every season, and they were strangers to the use of both bread and wine. Their grain was devoured in its crude state, or at best was coarsely pounded and baked with little skill into an unleavened paste. Compelled to share this savage mode of life, Gelimer and his attendants began to consider captivity or even death, as better than the daily hardships they endured. To avail himself of this favorable disposition, Verus, in a friendly letter, proposed a capitulation, and assured Gelimer of generous treatment from Belisarius and Justinian. The spirit of the Vandal prince, however, was still not wholly broken, and he refused the offers, while acknowledging the kindness of his enemy. In his answer he entreated the gifts of a lyre, a loaf of bread, and a sponge, and his messenger explained the grounds of this singular petition. At Medinus, he had never tasted the food of civilized nations. He wished to sing to music an ode of his misfortunes written by himself, and a swelling on his eyes needed a sponge for its cure. The brave Roman, touched with pity that such wants should be felt by the grandson and successor of Genseric, forthwith sent these presents up the mountain, but by no means abated the watchfulness of his blockade. The siege had already continued for upwards of 3 months, and several Vandals had sunk beneath its hardships, but Gelimer still displayed the stubborn inflexibility usual to despotic rulers, when the sight of a domestic affliction suddenly induced him to yield. In the hovel, where he sat gloomily brooding over his hopeless fortunes, a Moorish woman was preparing at the fire some coarse dough. 2 children, her son and the nephew of Gelimer, were watching her progress with the eager anxiety of famine. The young Vandal was the first to seize the precious morsel, still glowing with heat, and blackened with ashes, when the Moor, by blows and violence, forced it from his mouth. So fierce a struggle for food at such an age overcame the sternness of Gelimer. He agreed to surrender on the same terms lately held out to him, and the promise of Verus were confirmed by the Roman general, who sent Cyprian as his envoy to Papua. The late sovereign of Africa re-entered his capital as a suppliant and prisoner, and at the suburb of Achelous beheld his conqueror for the first time. With the capitulation of Gelimer, the Vandal was at an end. There now remained to Belisarius but the important task of making the conquered countries permanently useful to the Romans. But, while occupied in this design, his glory having provoked envy, he was accused to Justinian of the intention of making himself king over the territories he had conquered. With the weakness of a little mind, the emperor so far yielded to the base accusation as to send a message to Belisarius, indicating his suspicions. The latter immediately departed from Carthage, and taking with him his spoils and captives, proceeded to Constantinople. This ready obedience dissipated the suspicions of the emperor, and he made ample and prompt reparation for his unfounded jealousy. Medals were struck by his orders, bearing on one side the effigy of the emperor, and on the other that of the victorious general, encircled by the inscription, Belisarius, the glory of the Romans. Beside this, the honors of a triumph were decreed him, the first ever witnessed in the eastern capital. The ceremony was in the highest degree imposing. The triumphal procession marched from the house of Belisarius to the hippodrome, filled with exulting thousands where Justinian and Theodorus sat enthroned. The footnote reads, "The hippodrome, a space where the chariot races were exhibited." End of footnote. Among the Vandal captives, Gelimer was distinguished by the purple of a sovereign. He shed no tears, but frequently repeated the words of Solomon, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." When he reached the imperial throne and was commanded to cast aside the ensigns of royalty, Belisarius hastened to do the same, to show him that he was to undergo no insult as a prisoner, but only to yield the customary homage of a subject. We may pause for a moment to reflect upon the caprices of fortune which had raised a comedian, in the person of Theodora, to see the successor of Genseric and Scipio prostrate as slaves before her footstool. Both the conqueror and captive experienced the effects of imperial generosity. The former received a large share of the spoil as his reward, and was named consul for the ensuing year. To the Vandal monarch, an extensive estate in Galatia was assigned, to which he retired, and in peaceful obscurity spent the remainder of his days. We must now turn our attention to Italy. Theodoric the Great, the natural son of Theodomer, king of the Ostrogoths, became the master of Italy toward the close of the 5th century. The Gothic dominion was thus established in the ancient seat of the Roman Empire, and the king of the Goths was seated upon the throne of the Caesars. Theodoric has furnished one of the few instances in which a successful soldier has abandoned warlike pursuits for the duties of civil administration, and instead of seeking power by his arms, has devoted himself to the improvement of his kingdom by a peaceful unity. Upright and active in his conduct, he enforced discipline among his soldiers, and so tempered his general kindness by acts of salutary rigor that he was loved as if indulgent, yet obeyed as if severe. He applied himself to the revival of trade, the support of manufactures, and the encouragement of agriculture. At the death of this great monarch in 526, his grandson, Athalaric, then only 10 years of age, became king. After a nominal reign of 8 years, he died in consequence of his dissipations, and was thus succeeded by Theodatus, the nephew of Theodoric. This prince, having attained the throne by the murder of Amalisantha, the widow of Theodoric, Justinian regarded him as an usurper, stained with an atrocious crime, and therefore determined to drive him from his throne. Accordingly, a force of 12,000 men was dispatched to Italy under Belisarius. Landing at Catania, in Sicily, they surprised the Goths, and had little difficulty in reducing the island. Fixing his headquarters at Syracuse, he was making preparations to enter the heart of Italy when a messenger came to inform him that a serious insurrection had broken out at Carthage. He immediately set out for that place. On his arrival, the insurgents fled, but Belisarius pursued them, overtook them, and though their force was 4 times as great as his own, they were completely defeated in a pitched battle. Returning to Carthage, the Roman general was informed by a messenger from Sicily that a formidable mutiny had broken out in his army there. He immediately embarked and soon restored his troops to order and discipline. The rapid conquest of Sicily by Belisarius struck terror into the heart of King Theodatus, who was weak by nature and depressed by age. He was therefore induced to subscribe an ignominious treaty with Justinian, some of the conditions of which forcibly display the pusillanimity of one emperor and the vanity of the other. Theodatus promised that no statue should be raised to his honor without another of Justinian at his right hand, and that the imperial name should always precede his own in the acclamations of the people at public games and festivals, as if the shouts of the rabble were matter for a treaty. But even this humiliating compact was not sufficient for the grasping avarice of Justinian. He required of Theodatus the surrender of his throne, which the latter promised, but before the compact could be carried into effect, he was driven from his throne, and Vitiges, a soldier of humble birth, but great energy and experience, was declared his successor. Establishing his headquarters at Ravenna, the Gothic king was making preparations to sustain his cause when Belisarius, who had taken Naples, was invited to Rome by Pope Silverius. Taking advantage of this opportunity, he immediately advanced and triumphantly entered the Eternal City. Rome had now been under the dominion of its Gothic conquerors for 60 years, during which it had enjoyed the advantages of peace and prosperity. It had been the object of peculiar care, attention, and munificence, and had received the respect due to the ancient mistress of the world. Still, the people at large looked upon their rulers as foreigners and barbarians, and desired the return of the imperial sway, seeming to forget that they were preferring a foreign to a native government. Belisarius lost no time in repairing the fortifications of Rome, while he actively extended his conquests in the southern parts of Italy. His military fame was now a host, and most of the towns submitted, either from a preference of the Byzantine government or respect for the military prowess of the Roman general. The great achievements of Belisarius strike us with wonder when we consider the feeble means with which they were accomplished. His force at the outset of his invasion of Italy did not exceed 12,000 men. These were now much reduced by the bloody siege of Naples, and by his subsequent successes, which made it necessary to supply garrisons for the captured towns. Vitiges, in his Adriatic capital, had spent the winter in preparations, and when the spring arrived, he set forth with a powerful army. Knowing the small force of Belisarius, he hurried forward towards Rome, fearing only that his enemy should escape by flight. The genius of Belisarius never shone with greater luster than at this moment. By numerous devices, he contrived to harass the Gothic army in their march, but owing to the flight of a detachment of his troops whom he had stationed at one of the towers to delay their progress, they at last came upon him by surprise. He was at the moment without the city, attended only by 1,000 of his guards, when suddenly he found himself surrounded by the van of the Gothic cavalry. He now displayed not only the skill of a general, but the personal courage and prowess of a soldier. Distinguished by the charger whom he had often rode in battle, a bay with a white face, he was seen in the foremost ranks animating his men to the conflict. "That is Belisarius!" exclaimed some Italian deserters who knew him. "Aim at the bay!" was forthwith the cry through the Gothic squadrons, and a cloud of arrows was soon aimed at the conspicuous mark. It seemed as if the fate of Italy was felt to be suspended upon a single life, so fierce was the struggle to kill or capture the Roman leader. Amid the deadly strife, however, Belisarius remained unhurt, and it is said that more of the army fell that day by his single arm than by that of any other Roman. His guards displayed the utmost courage and devotion to his person, rallying around him and raising their bucklers on every side to ward off the showers of missiles that flew with deadly aim at his breast. Not less than 1,000 of the enemy fell in the conflict, a number equal to the whole Roman troop engaged in the battle. The Gothics at length gave way, and Belisarius with his guards re-entered the city. On the morrow, March 12, AD 537, the memorable siege of Rome began. Finding it impossible, even with their vast army, to encircle the walls of the city, which were 12 miles in length, the Goths selected 5 of the 14 gates and invested them. They now cut through the aqueducts in order to stop the supply of water, and several of them, having never been repaired, remain to this day extending into the country and seeming like the outstretched and broken limbs of an expiring giant. Though the baths of the city were stopped, the Tiber supplied the people with water for all needful purposes. The resources and activity of Belisarius knew no bounds, yet he had abundant occasion for all the advantages these could supply. The relative smallness of his force, the feebleness of the defenses, the fickleness and final disaffection of the people, the intrigues of Vitiges, and his vastly superior army constituted a web of difficulties which would have overwhelmed any other than a man whose genius could extort good from evil and convert weakness into strength. For a whole year, the encircling walls of Rome were the scenes of almost incessant attack and defense. The fertile genius of Vitiges suggested 1,000 expedients, and the number as well as courage of his troops enabled him to plan and execute a variety of daring schemes. Yet, he was always baffled by his vigilant rival, and his most elaborate devices were rendered fruitless by the superior genius of the Roman general. At last, on the 21st of March, AD 538, foreseeing that Belisarius was about to receive reinforcements, and despairing of success in the siege, Vitiges withdrew his army, suffering in his retreat a fearful massacre from a sally of the Roman troops. Vitiges returned to Ravenna, and Belisarius soon invested it. While he was pressing the siege, Justinian, probably alarmed by the threats of the Persian king, entered into a treaty with the ambassadors of Vitiges, by which he agreed to a partition of Italy, taking one half himself and allowing the Gothic king to retain the other portion. Belisarius refused to ratify this treaty, and soon after was pressed by the Goths to become their king. Vitiges even joined in this request, and Belisarius had now the easy opportunity of making himself the emperor of the West, without the remotest fear of failure. But he was too deeply impressed with his oath of allegiance to allow him to entertain a treacherous design toward his sovereign, and he rejected the tempting offer. The merit of his fidelity under these circumstances is heightened by the consideration that he had refused the ratification of the treaty, and was well aware that reproach or even hostility might await him at Constantinople. Soon after these events, Ravenna capitulated, and Belisarius became its master. His fame was now at its height, but this only served to inflame the envy of his rivals at Constantinople. These, insidiously working upon the suspicious temper of Justinian, induced him to command the return of Belisarius to Constantinople. With prompt obedience, he embarked at Ravenna, carrying with him his Gothic captives and treasure. After 5 years of warfare, from the foot of Etna to the banks of the Po, during which he had subdued nearly the same extent of country which had been acquired by the Romans in the first 5 centuries from the building of that city, he arrived at Constantinople. The voice of envy was silenced for a time, and Belisarius was appointed to the command of the army now about to proceed against the Persians. The captive monarch of the Goths was received with generous courtesy by the emperor, and an ample estate was allotted to him in Asia. Justinian gazed with admiration on the strength and beauty of the Gothic captives, their fair complexions, auburn locks, and lofty stature. A great number of these, attracted by the fame and character of Belisarius, enlisted in his guards. In the spring of the year 540, Chosroes, or Nushirvan, the Persian king, invaded the Roman provinces in the east. The next year Belisarius proceeded against him and took his station at Dara. Here, instead of a well-appointed army, he found only a confused and discordant mass of undisciplined men. After various operations being baffled by the treachery or incapacity of his subalterns, he was obliged to retreat, and closed a fruitless campaign by placing his men in winter quarters. Being recalled to Constantinople, he went thither, but took the field early in the spring with the most powerful army he had ever commanded. Nushirvan advanced into Syria, but, thwarted by the masterly maneuvers of Belisarius, he was at last obliged to retreat. Soon after, the Roman general being again recalled by Justinian, the most fatal disasters befell the Roman army. During these Persian campaigns, the political security, as well as the domestic happiness of Belisarius, were shaken by the misconduct of his wife. She had long been engaged in an intrigue with Theodosius, the young soldier newly baptized as an auspicious omen in the galley of the general upon his departure for Africa. Though told of this, Belisarius had been pacified by the protestations and artifices of Antonia. But while he was absent in Asia Minor, she, being left in Constantinople, pursued her licentious career with little scruple. Her son, Photius, a gallant young soldier, being a check upon her conduct, became the object of her hatred. While at the distance of 1,000 miles during the Persian campaign, he still experienced the malignant influence of her intrigues, and urged by a sense of duty to his stepfather, made him acquainted with his mother's depravity. When she afterwards joined her husband on the frontier, he caused her to be imprisoned, and sent Photius toward Ephesus to inflict summary punishment upon Theodosius. The latter was taken captive by Photius, and borne to Sicilia. Antonia, by her convenient intrigues in behalf of Theodora, had laid her under great obligations, and obtained the greatest influence over her. The empress, therefore, now interfered to save her friend. Positive injunctions were sent to Sicilia, and both Photius and Theodosius were brought to Constantinople. The former was cast into a dungeon and tortured at the rack. The latter was received with distinction, but he soon expired from illness. Photius, after a third escape from prison, proceeded to Jerusalem, where he took the habit of a monk, and finally attained the rank of abbot. Belisarius and Antonia were summoned to Constantinople, and the empress commanded the injured husband to abstain from the punishment of his wife. He obeyed this order of his sovereign. She next required a reconciliation in his hands, but he refused to comply with a demand which no sovereign had a right to make. He, therefore, remained at Constantinople under the secret displeasure of Theodora and Justinian, who only wanted some plausible pretext to accomplish his ruin. The invasion of Nushirvan in the ensuing spring impelled the terrified emperor to lay aside his animosity and restore the hero to the direction of the eastern armies. But in this campaign his former offense was aggravated, and the glory of saving the east was outweighed by the guilt of frankness. Justinian was recovering from a dangerous illness. A rumor of his death had reached the Roman camp, and Belisarius gave an opinion in favor of the emperor's nearest kinsman as his successor, instead of acknowledging the pretensions of Theodora to the throne. This declaration inflamed with equal anger the aspiring wife and the uxorious husband. Buzus, the second in command, who had concurred in these views, was confined in a subterranean dungeon so dark that the difference of day and night was never apparent to its inmate. Belisarius himself was recalled, with flattering professions of confidence and friendship, lest resentment should urge him to rebellion. But on his arrival at Constantinople, the mask was thrown aside. He was degraded from the rank of General of the East. A commission was dispatched into Asia to seize his treasures, and his personal guards, who had followed his standard through so many battles, were removed from his command. It was with mingled feelings of compassion and surprise that the people beheld the forlorn appearance of the general as he entered Constantinople and rode along the streets with a small and squalid train. Proceeding to the gates of the palace, he was exposed during the whole day to the scoffs and insults of the rabble. He was received by the emperor and Theodora with angry disdain, and when he withdrew, in the evening, to his lonely place, he frequently turned round, expecting to see the appointed assassins advancing upon him. In the evening, after sunset, a letter was brought to him from Theodora, declaring that his life was granted, and a portion of his fortune spared at the intercession of his wife, and she trusted that his future conduct would manifest his gratitude to his deliverer. The favorable moments of surprise and gratitude were improved by Antonia with her usual skill. Thus, by the artifices of 2 designing women, the conqueror of armies was subdued, and Belisarius once more became the duped and submissive husband. A fine of 300 pounds weight of gold was levied upon the property of Belisarius, and he was suffered for many months to languish in obscurity. In 544, however, he was appointed to the command of the war in Italy, whither he soon proceeded. Here, in his operations against far superior forces, he displayed the same genius as before, and in February 547 he again entered Rome. He pursued the war with various fortune, but at last, finding his means entirely inadequate to the necessities of the contest, he begged of the emperor either reinforcements or recall. Engrossed by religious quarrels, Justinian took the easier course and adopted the latter. Thus, after having desolated Italy with all the horrors of war for several years, he now abandoned it, merely from weakness and caprice. Belisarius returned to Constantinople, and for several years his life affords no remarkable occurrence. He continued in the tranquil enjoyment of opulence and dignities, but, in the year 559, various warlike tribes beyond the Danube, known under the general name of Bulgarians, marched southward, and desolated several provinces by sword, fire, and plunder. Zabergan, their enterprising leader, having passed the frozen Danube in the winter, detached one portion of his army for the pillage of Greece, and the other against the capital. So sudden and bold an aggression filled Constantinople with helpless and despairing terror. The people and the senators were agitated with fear, and the emperor sat trembling in his palace. In this general confusion and affright, all eyes were turned with hope to the conqueror of Africa and Italy. Though his constitution was broken by his military labors, his heart was alive to the call of his country, and Belisarius prepared to crown his glorious life by a last and decisive battle. He resumed his rusty armor, collected a handful of his scattered veterans, and in the return of martial spirit he seemed to shake off the weakness of decrepitude. Sallying from the city with 300 mounted men, he met Zabergan at the head of 2,000 cavalry. Selecting a favorable position, he withstood the onset, and seeming to recover the powers of his youth, he astonished all around him by his intrepidity and skill. After a severe and bloody struggle, the Bulgarians were driven back in the utmost disorder. 400 fell on the field, and Zabergan himself escaped with difficulty. The whole army of barbarians, amounting to many thousands, were seized with contagious fear, raised their camp, and retreated to the north. Belisarius was preparing for a close pursuit when again his enemies awakened the suspicions of Justinian by suggesting that he was aiming at popular favor with disloyal views. The enthusiastic praises of his heroic conduct by the people turned even the emperor's heart to jealousy, and he chose rather to purchase the departure of the barbarians by tribute than to permit Belisarius to obtain new laurels by chastising their audacity. From this period, Belisarius continued under the displeasure of Justinian, whose suspicious temper seemed to grow more virulent as his faculties sunk into the dotage of years. In 563, several conspiracies against the life of Justinian were detected, and under torture, some of the domestics of Belisarius accused their master of participation. This testimony, disproved by the long life and the habitually submissive loyalty of Belisarius, was sufficient for his conviction. He was stripped of his fortune, deprived of his guards, and detained as a close prisoner in his palace. The other conspirators were condemned and executed. But in consideration of the past services of Belisarius, the decree of death was changed for that of blindness, and his eyes were accordingly put out. The footnote reads, "This portion of the story of Belisarius has been the subject of controversy. It has been doubted by Gibbon and other historians whether the infliction of blindness upon Belisarius and his beggary were not mere traditionary fables. But Lord Mahon, in his excellent life of the great Roman general from which we have drawn the preceding account, appears to have established their authenticity. The beautiful tale of Belisarius by Marmontel is fictitious in many of its details." He was now restored to liberty, but, deprived of all means of subsistence, he was compelled to beg his bread before the gates of the convent of Larus. There he stood, with a wooden platter which he held out for charity, exclaiming to the passers-by, "Give a penny to Belisarius the general." The affecting scene was long impressed upon the recollection of the people, and it would seem that this spectacle of persecuted merit aroused some dangerous feelings of indignation and pity, and he was therefore removed from public view. Belisarius was brought back to his former palace, and a portion of his treasures was allotted for his use. His death, which was doubtless hastened by the grief and hardships of his lot, occurred in 565, and Antonia, who survived him, devoted the remains of her life and fortune to the cloister. In person, Belisarius was tall and commanding, his features regular and noble. When he appeared in the streets of Constantinople, he never failed to attract the admiration of the people. As a military leader, he was enterprising, firm, and fearless. His conception was clear, and his judgment rapid and decisive. His conquests were achieved with smaller means than any other of like extent recorded in history. He experienced reverses in the field, but never did he fail without strong and sufficient reason. His superior tactics covered his defeats, retrieved his losses, and prevented his enemies from reaping the fruits of victory. Never, even in the most desperate emergencies, was he known to lose his courage or presence of mind. Though living in a barbarous and dissolute age, Belisarius possessed many shining virtues. In the march of his armies, he would avoid the trampling of the cornfields, nor would he allow his soldiers even to gather apples from the trees without making payment to the villagers. After a victory, it was his first care to extend mercy and protection to the vanquished. The gift of a golden bracelet or collar rewarded any valorous achievements among his troops. The loss of a horse or weapon was immediately supplied from his private funds. The wounded ever found in him a father and a friend. To all he was open and easy of access, and by his courteous demeanor often comforted where he could not relieve. From his generosity, one would have deemed him rich; from his manners, poor. His private virtues promoted and confirmed the discipline of his soldiers. None ever saw him flushed with wine, nor could the charms of his fairest captives overcome his conjugal fidelity. But the most remarkable feature in the character of Belisarius is his steadfast loyalty, and the noble magnanimity with which he overlooked the suspicious meanness and ingratitude of his sovereign. It is impossible to find in history another instance of an individual so strongly induced to rebellion by treacherous treatment on the part of his country, and the opportunity of placing a crown upon his head without the risk of effectual opposition, who refused, from patriotic motives, the double temptation. That Belisarius had faults is not to be denied. His blind submission to his wife displayed great weakness, and led him into most of the errors which are charged upon his public career. In his last campaign in Italy, his wealth having been exhausted by an enormous fine, he endeavored to repair his losses by imitating the rapacity universally practiced by other commanders of that period. He thus inflicted upon his memory a serious stain, and showed that, however he was exalted above the age, he was still a man. His whole career affords a striking moral, coinciding with the emphatic language of Scripture, "Put not thy trust in princes." You've just heard the chapter on Belisarius from the book Famous Men of Ancient Times by S.G. Goodrich. If you'd like to check out the rest of this book, it's available at Project Gutenberg. Go to gutenberg.org. Thank you for listening to this supplemental episode of Men of the West. I'm your host, Shawn Michaels. If you like this episode, you could really help us out by leaving a review and sharing it with a friend. Until next time, keep seeking the West.